Shreekala, I am in. I'll just disconnect and then once again I'll join. Okay. Okay. Now you can see me.
Ipo കാണാം teacher.
Yeah, that's it. Chalo, it is 11:30.
Yes, sir. എല്ലാവർക്കും നമസ്കാരം. ശ്രീ ശങ്കരാചാര്യ സംസ്കൃത സർവകലാശാല കൊയിലാണ്ടി പ്രാദേശിക കേന്ദ്രം സംഘടിപ്പിക്കുന്ന 3-day വെബിനാർ, 3 ദിവസം നീണ്ടു നിൽക്കുന്ന വെബിനാർ, അതിൽ വേദാന്തത്തിന്റെ ഇന്റർ ഡിസിപ്ലിനറി അപ്രോച്ചുകൾ, മറ്റ് ദർശനങ്ങളും മറ്റ് സിദ്ധാന്തങ്ങളും വേദാന്തത്തെ എങ്ങനെ സ്വാധീനിക്കുന്നു എന്ന രീതിയിലുള്ള ഒരു ഏരിയ ആണ് സെലക്ട് ചെയ്യപ്പെട്ടത്. അതിലേക്ക് രണ്ടാമത്തെ സെഷനാണ് ഇപ്പോൾ നടക്കാൻ പോകുന്നത്. ആദ്യ സെഷൻ ടെസ്റ്റ് നടന്നു കഴിഞ്ഞതേ ഉള്ളൂ. ഈ സെഷനിലേക്ക് എല്ലാവരെയും സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുക എന്നുള്ളതാണ് എൻ്റെ നിക്ഷിപ്തമായ കർത്തവ്യം. അപ്പം കാലടി സർവകലാശാല വേദാന്ത വിഭാഗം അധ്യക്ഷനായ ഡോക്ടർ മുരളീധരൻ സാറ്, പ്രാദേശിക കേന്ദ്രം അധ്യക്ഷനായ പുഷ്പദാസ് സാറ്, വിഭാഗത്തിലെയും അധ്യാപകര്, മറ്റ് വിഭാഗങ്ങളിലെ അധ്യാപകര്, ഗവേഷക വിദ്യാർത്ഥികള്, കൊയിലാണ്ടി പ്രാദേശിക കേന്ദ്രത്തിലെ വിദ്യാർത്ഥികള്, അതുകൂടാതെ നമ്മുടെ യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റി അല്ലാതെ മറ്റ് ധാരാളം ഗവേഷക വിദ്യാർത്ഥികളും അധ്യാപകരും അക്കാഡമിഷ്യൻസും ഈ പ്രോഗ്രാം, ഈ 3-ദിന വെബിനാർ ശ്രവിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. നമുക്ക് അവർ അറിയാം. അവരെല്ലാവരെയും, ഓരോരുത്തരെയുമായിട്ടും എല്ലാവരെയായിട്ടും കാലടി സംസ്കൃത സർവകലാശാല കൊയിലാണ്ടി പ്രാദേശിക കേന്ദ്രത്തിന് വേണ്ടിയിട്ട് ഈ വെബിനാറിലേക്ക് സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുന്നു. ഇതിന്റെ സംഘാടകനായ നിഷാദ് സാറാണ്. അദ്ദേഹം കൊയിലാണ്ടി പ്രാദേശിക കേന്ദ്രത്തിന്റെ വിഭാഗത്തിന്റെ വേദാന്ത വിഭാഗത്തിന്റെ ഇൻചാർജ് അധ്യാപകനാണ്. അദ്ദേഹത്തെയും ഇതിലേക്ക് പ്രത്യേകം തന്നെ സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുന്നു. ഔദ്യോഗികതയുടെ പേരിൽ നിഷാദ് സാറേയും പുഷ്പദാസ് സാറേയും മറ്റ് അധ്യാപകരെയും ഒരിക്കൽ കൂടി വീണ്ടും സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്യുകയാണ്. ഇന്ന് ഈ വെബിനാറിന്റെ രണ്ടാം സെഷനിലെ പേപ്പർ അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നത് നമ്മുടെ യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റിയിലെ തന്നെ ഫിലോസഫി വിഭാഗം അധ്യാപികയായ ഡോക്ടർ ശ്രീകല നായരാണ്. മാഡത്തിന് എല്ലാവർക്കും വളരെ വളരെ സുപരിചിതമായ ഒരു വ്യക്തിത്വമാണ് ശ്രീകല നായർ. എല്ലാവർക്കും അറിയാം. പരിചയപ്പെടുത്താതെ തന്നെ ബോത്ത് ഈസ്റ്റേൺ ആൻഡ് വെസ്റ്റേൺ ഫിലോസഫിയിൽ ടീച്ചർ ഒരു അതോറിറ്റി തന്നെയാണ്. ധാരാളം ദേശീയ അന്തർദേശീയ പുരസ്കാരങ്ങൾ മാഡം നേടിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. പഠിക്കുന്ന കാലത്ത് തന്നെ അറിഞ്ഞതനുസരിച്ച് M.A റാങ്ക് ഹോൾഡറാണ് ടീച്ചർ. ഗോൾഡ് മെഡലിസ്റ്റ് ആണ്. പിൽക്കാലത്ത് ICPR മെമ്പറാണെന്ന് നമ്മൾക്കറിയാം. ടീച്ചർ ഇന്ത്യൻ ഫിലോസഫി കോൺഗ്രസിന്റെ ജോയിന്റ് സെക്രട്ടറി ആയിട്ട് ധാരാളം യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റികളിലെ ഫാക്കൽറ്റി മെമ്പറായിട്ട്, അക്കാഡമിക് കൗൺസിൽ മെമ്പറായിട്ട് ടീച്ചർ മികച്ച സേവനം ദാർശനിക മേഖലയിലും അക്കാഡമിക് മേഖലയിലും ഇന്ത്യയിൽ അകത്തും പുറത്തും നൽകി വരികയാണ് ടീച്ചർ നമുക്ക് ഈ സെഷനിൽ മുഖ്യ പ്രസംഗം അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്നതിനായി ലഭിച്ചതിന് നമ്മുടെ ഭാഗ്യവുമാണ്. നല്ലൊരു പ്രസംഗം കേൾക്കാനുള്ള ആകാംക്ഷയാണ് എല്ലാവരും ഇരിക്കുന്നത് എനിക്കറിയാം. ദ പ്രോബ്ലംസ് ഓഫ് ദി എൻവേൾഡ് സബ്ജക്റ്റിവിറ്റി, ഹസ്രൽ ആൻഡ് ശങ്കര എന്ന വിഷയമാണ് ടീച്ചർ പറയാൻ പോകുന്നത്. ശങ്കരാചാര്യ നമുക്ക് ഏകദേശം സുപരിചിത ആണ്. അദ്വൈത വേദാന്തത്തിന്റെ പ്രചാരകനും ഫൗണ്ടറും എന്ന നിലയിൽ ശങ്കരാചാര്യ നമ്മളെല്ലാവരും പഠിച്ചതും പഠിപ്പിക്കുന്നതുമാണ് ഒരു മേഖലയാണ് ശങ്കര ഫിലോസഫി. പക്ഷെ ഹസ്രൽ നമ്മൾ മനസ്സിലാക്കിയെടുത്തോളം ഫിനോമിനോളജി സ്കൂളിന്റെ സ്ഥാപകനും ഫൗണ്ടറും അങ്ങനെ ഒരു മേഖലയെ കൺസെപ്റ്റ് വികസിപ്പിച്ചെടുത്ത് ഒരു ദാർശനികനും മാത്തമെറ്റീഷ്യനും ഒക്കെ ആയിരുന്നു ഹസ്രൽ. രണ്ടുപേരുടെയും എൻവേൾഡ് സബ്ജക്റ്റിവിറ്റി കൺസെപ്റ്റ് ടീച്ചർ അതിവിദഗ്ധമായി അവതരിപ്പിക്കാൻ നമുക്ക് എല്ലാവർക്കും അറിയാം. ഞാൻ ടീച്ചറുടെ സമയത്തെ അപഹരിക്കുന്നില്ല. ഈ ഒരു സെഷനിലേക്ക് ടീച്ചറെയും എല്ലാവരെയും വീണ്ടും സ്വാഗതം ചെയ്തിട്ട് ഈ സെഷൻ വളരെ ധന്യമാക്കാൻ എല്ലാവരോടും അഭ്യർത്ഥിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് ഞാൻ എൻ്റെ വാക്കുകൾ അവസാനിപ്പിക്കുന്നു. ടീച്ചറെ ഈ പേപ്പർ പ്രസന്റ് ചെയ്യുന്നതിലേക്ക് ഒരിക്കൽ കൂടി ക്ഷണിച്ചുകൊണ്ട് ഞാൻ എൻ്റെ വാക്കുകൾ അവസാനിപ്പിക്കുന്നു. എല്ലാവർക്കും നമസ്കാരം, സ്വാഗതം.
Namaste. Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. I don't see Nishad. Can I have?
Teacher. Kelka.
Okay, can you come in the video? I haven't seen you. So thank you, Nishad, for this wonderful opportunity. Atma Avalokanaya. Like, every time we speak, we get an opportunity to look at ourselves. And this is again an opportunity to closely examine my doxastic system. And that is all that I do in every talk. which these days is frequent. People often complain that I don't write much, as most of the people in the university know. It's a fact, because speaking is one thing, it's easier, and the other thing is, it is immediately encashed, because what do you get out of speaking? So quite like, I follow the Socratic method, and to speak is divine, to write is evil. Because whatever you write, you immediately come to negate it. And of course, writing rarely happens with me, but then that is a kind of, helpless deliverance, where you have been pained with it's a kind of a prasuti where you can't bear it anymore, you write. So speaking is one thing that I love it, for the reasons that I have discussed with you. So lovely, as I see it, as in every case, it is Atma Avalokanaya that I'm trying to see myself. And let me see how good I see myself. Quite like in a dance performance, we can never predict. Thank you for those kind words, Suresh ji. I don't really think I deserve all those kind words that he has delivered. But yes, of course, I'm an ardent devotee and servant of the discipline of philosophy, and that explains everything of my 4 decades long service to this discipline. So friends, in this, I have titled the paper, as Nishad wanted me to speak, juxtapose Vedanta to any of the Western traditions, and I thought that let me juxtapose it with one of the traditions that stand close to the Advaita theory, and that is phenomenology, particularly that of Husserl, because Heidegger, in a way, moves away from the Husserlian phenomenology. I'll come to that a little later. So, title my paper is the problem of enworlded subjectivity. So, in this paper, what I attempt to do is to reveal the phenomenological method employed in Advaita Vedanta to redeem the pure self from the enworlded subjectivity. What is enworlded subjectivity? I'll come to that. The paper would be navigated like this. First, we shall discuss about the very rationale of proceeding with a self-inquiry. Why should, after all, we take up a self-inquiry, Adhyatma Vidya as we call it, followed by the description of the 2 types of cells that Advaita speaks about, and the life worlds, and finally reflect upon the path that leads the self to its original or native home. So this standard Advaitic method will be juxtaposed to the Husserlian phenomenological method to see how the 2 traditions can be enriched by borrowing the wisdom from each other. Now, this is no exercise of comparison. When I was doing philosophy in late 80s, comparison was, the thriving mode, because we were still in the colonial aftermath. We were not sure whether whatever we call philosophy in this land has anything to do with philosophy, because our colonial masters have told us that, look, you don't have philosophy as such. This is some kind of religious superstitions, dipped in psychological factors, so on and so forth. So we were afraid. So I remember my seniors were all busy doing comparison. Sankara was poor thing compared to anything and everything. Wittgenstein, Burks, and I don't remember Bradley, who's not Husserl. Husserl was not famous those days. To anybody and everybody available in the idealist stream. But now, the trend has gone, because we are now confident, we know what we are sure of our philosophies, and we don't have to prove, we don't have to borrow the scale of anyone to match up our philosophies. But nevertheless, we can place our philosophies before the globe And one way of presenting it is to juxtapose it with one familiar kind. And this is what I'm trying to do. So my audience can be both Indian as well as Western, because I think the Westerners will be more benefited because they will know the value of Indian philosophy. Because here, where Husserl drops, Sankara takes the thought ahead. And this is what I'm trying to impress you. Shankara's Brahmasutra Bhashya commences the discussion on self-inquiry by examining what is truly worthy of inquiry. Now, the objects of the world no doubt call for inquiry for the purpose of explaining them. We need to explain the objects of the world. The laptop in front of me, the code, so on and so forth. They are worthy of explanation. However, whether they are worthy of inquiry is the important question that one should ask. Are they the ultimate entities that have to be explained? Here, Shankara, following the Upanishads, makes a distinction between the entities that can be inquired into. And he speaks of two types of entities that can be inquired into: the things of the world and the Brahman/Atman. Professor R. Balasubramanian, my master, has used, Brahman hyphen Atman, because, as you know, in Upanishads, in all the Shruti, Brahman has been equated with Atman. So they are synonymous terms, and therefore I use the term Brahman/Atman. Though the things in the world are important from the empirical viewpoint, their satisfaction always lead further to the question, what then? What is after this? Their satisfaction, once you know about a particular empirical thing, you are invariably led to the question, what then? What next? So now this, Shankara analytically suggests that the knowledge of the finite things of the world is therefore incomplete. And this essential incompleteness of empirical knowledge of the finite things point of the infinite, the primal being, the ultimate, whose realization alone gives one a sense of fulfillment. Thus, the Upanishadic seers have made a distinction between two objects of inquiry, the ordinary and the extraordinary. Now, the ordinary objects are the mundane empirical things. Of course, they need to be attended to, but there is something called the extraordinary entity, which demands real inquiry, and which indeed is something which is worthy of inquiry. In Mundaka Upanishad, Angiras instructs Shaunaka, as you all know, on the two objects that can be known. Dve vidye veditavye. The lower or the ordinary objects of inquiry consist of the four Vedas and the six Vedangas, Shiksha, Kalpadi. The higher knowledge is that of the immutable Brahman or Atman, of the Dve Vidye Veditavye. The lower is that of the four Vedas and the six Vedangas, and the higher knowledge is that of the immutable Brahman or Atman. While the things of the world are ordinary, Brahman or Atman is extraordinary. Now, this is the distinction between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Correspondingly, the knowledge of the ordinary is of the lower nature, while the knowledge of the extraordinary demands greater attention. Now, this extraordinary object has been referred by Yajnavalkya and Brihadaranyaka Upanishad as the famous mantra, as you all know. Drashtavyam, he says, Atmavade Shrotavyo, Drashtavyo, Mantavyo, Nididhyasadavyo, Maitri. So, this Drashtavya, Professor Balasubramanian says, this term Drashtavya, it has not been used in the imperative sense. It has been used in the gerundive sense. What is gerundive sense? Gerundive sense suggests that it is something which has to be seen, or which means that it is fit to be seen, or it also implicates the necessity of understanding it. So here, Drashtavya suggests Prakarshena Drashtum Yogya Hatyartha. So now, once we realize that we are on the inquiring mood, or we are onto the path of inquiry, let's be clear that the inquiry presupposes an inquiring subject as well as an inquiry object, or what are we trying to inquire upon. Now, who is the subject that takes up this inquiry? Now, Shankara clarifies that the subject who undertakes the inquiry is the jiva. Here, by jiva, Shankara means jnana karma adhikari. Now, you know that, starting from the finite, the small entities which are atomic up to the human beings all have jivas. But then only the jnana adhikarins, the jnana karma adhikarins alone have been classified under this because, of the three faculties. That is knowing, feeling, and willing. Of course, feeling has been shared by the rest of the jivas, but jnana and karma, that is the knowing and willing, is something unique to human beings, and only those jivas are classified under this category of jiva. And now, what is the object of inquiry? Having identified jiva as the inquirer, Shankara is looking at the object of inquiry. What is being trying to look at? What is the object of inquiry? The entire world conditioned by space, time, and causality becomes the object of inquiry. Thus, Shankara views that any philosophy worth the name should take up as its primary exercise an inquiry on the jiva and the world and their interaction. How jiva interacts with the world, and also the truth in and behind them. What we see is not the truth. The interaction with the jiva and the world is mysterious, and I'm trying to unravel the mystery that is involved in this interaction between the jiva and the world. Now, it is the jiva which has been characterized as the enworlded subjectivity. Now, as the term itself suggests, it's been clear that the jiva has been represented as something which is enworlded, suggesting that world has gone into the very system of jiva. And so therefore it is a kind of a subjectivity which is enworlded. It is not pure subjectivity, which is enworlded subjectivity. And I see that the whole phenomenological endeavor in Advaita Vedanta is centered around this concept of jiva. Friends, you all might think that, look, Shankara speaks always about the pure self, pure consciousness, and jiva is only incidentally being referred. No. Actually, while the Shruti speaks repeatedly about the pure consciousness, Shankara's whole exercise is focused on this empirical self and its transcendence. He is focused on the method of transcendence and only to point at the goal that he speaks about the pure self, and repeatedly speaks about the distinction between the empirical self and the transcendental self. So the whole of the Advaitic exercise, Advaita should be seen as a method rather than a theory. And in this whole method, he speaks about the entanglement of the jiva into the world and how this jiva can get disentangled. And that is all the system is about. Now, this jiva is a complex entity comprising of both the drik and the drishya. Now, we presume the adhyasa is about this, the jiva taking upon itself the role of a pure subject. It thinks that it is the drik alone. So this is comprising a mixture of the drik and the drishya. The complex nature of the jiva that has been explicated by Shankara in Drigdrishya Viveka evidently speaks at length about this. Now, this jiva in the world, we should specify this term in hyphenated form, the jiva in the world, because there is no jiva independent of the world. Jiva has to be spoken in relation with the world. So is the case with the world. There is no independent world bereft of jiva. So there is this this, mutual dependence of both the jiva as well as the world. So talking about the jiva, I said that jiva is a complex entity. It has two dimensions as a subject. Now, what are the dimensions? One is the pure self, which is the essence of the jiva, and the other, the embodied or the empirical self, which is associated with the body and the world. In his attempt to locate the pure self, Sankara says, how systematically he dislocates the pure self from the empirical self. He says, when the eye is the seer, when I see the laptop, when I is the seer, the objects are the seen. When the eye eventually becomes the object, the mind becomes the seer. But when the mind and its cogitations and modifications, vrittis, become the objects, the witness self becomes the seer, and there ends the exercise. There is no case where the witness self becomes objectified. In brief, the phenomenal world or the lived world, as Husserl would call it, the lived world is where the self, the enworlded self comes out and creates the world for itself. That is what's called the phenomenal world, or what is called the lived world. The lived world is private. You see, it's my world. We have is due to the entanglement of the jiva with the objects, which in turn structures it. So there is both ways structuring it. As the jiva goes about structuring the world also structures the jiva. That is how the world gets into the jiva. Hence, Shankara's suggestion that we should understand the jiva and the world in relation with one another, for both do not have independent existence as such. You'll be surprised to see this is precisely what Husserl also says. Just as we speak about jiva in the world, we may also speak about jiva in the body. See, encasement in the body and encasement in the world are not two different things, because both are being constituted with the same entities called the five elements. So the body may therefore be characterized as a micro world, while the world as such is the macro. So whatever that is there in the body is there in the world. Once you understand the body, you understand the world. And friends, significantly, once you understand your body, you understand the world, and vice versa. Once you understand the world, you understand the body. Well, that is incidental, not relevant here. So while problematizing on the enworlded subjectivity, both these worlds, that is the micro as well as the macro, and the self entangled in it, should be considered identical. So you can speak about this entanglement in terms of the body or in terms of the world, they are identical. As the pure self for transcendental subjectivity, Sankara takes all efforts to distinguish it from the empirical one. The jiva is other than the world and stands disassociated from it. The whole exercise is to disassociate the jiva from the world. The self, qua self, qua, Q-U-A, qua, in relation with, it's a Greek term. So the self in relation with the self. As usual in the entangled state, in the enworlded state, the self is in relation with the world. But when the self gets back in its original home and gets in relation with the self, it is a homogeneous consciousness. Egatma pratyesara, as the Mandukya says. The seventh mantra, I think it's beautiful, where it has been said in negation. I forget the mantra. Do you remember that seventh mantra, Shiva? Anirdesham, I forget. Egatma pratyasaram shandam shivam advaitam satma.
Nanda pratyam na bahish pratyam.
Nanda pratyam na bahish pratyam na prajnanaghanam na pratyam na pratyam.
Adrishyam avyavaharyam
agrahyam
agrahyam alakshanam
agrahyam
Avyapadesham ekatma
Chandam Shivam Advaidam Satma Savitnyeha. When my professor R. Balasubramanian speaks about this mantra, horripilation comes onto my body. Such a beautiful mantra. So, Ekatma Pratyayasara. So, it has the single homogeneous state of consciousness. And it is one only and non-dual, and Ekameva Advati. I mean, it's immutable and eternal and Nitya. So this is the pure consciousness, which is also constituent of the Jiva. So now some contemporary thinkers suggest that viewing the Advaitic method through the phenomenological lens might prove fruitful both for both the systems. Professor R. Balasubramanian has viewed that Edmund Husserl's later views of phenomenological method, I mean, not the early Husserl, the later Husserl. The early Husserl was, obsessed with a lot of mathematics, as someone was introducing here, said, yes, Husserl was a mathematician. So Husserl's later views on phenomenological method resemble a lot of Shankara's Advaita theories. Now, Husserl, who died in the early part of the bygone century, that is 20th century, has effected a Copernican revolution in the philosophy of mind in the West. Till then, starting from Descartes, the famous cogito theories and his Cartesian dualism. There were theories after theories on the philosophy of mind, and by the beginning of 20th century, science was developing in positivist right, by and large, to tie it down to the physicalist theories. But Husserl made a Copernican revolution to this and created a unity of consciousness that has fascinated many modern philosophers. Now, he spoke about what is called the transcendental ego. By ego, it is not ahankara, please. Ego means self. So he spoke about a transcendental self. Now, mind you, transcendental ego has not been spoken by for the first time by Husserl. There were predecessors. For instance, Immanuel Kant has spoken about transcendental ego as the self that is necessary for a unified empirical self-consciousness. So Kant said that whatever that comes from the senses has to be unified. So there has to be categories that categorizes the various sensations in order to provide the prepositional sense of our cogitations. Because I don't say that when I see a red round ball, I don't say that I see something reddish, roundish, softish kind of a thing. Instead, I would say that I see a red round ball, which means that whatever sensations that has been received from the senses has been put into categories of class, space, time, so on and so forth. And then it comes out in the form of a neat preposition, right? So now the self, he called the transcendental ego, has this job of becoming the foundation or the unification of the empirical self-consciousness. So for Kant, it synthesizes sensations according to the categories of the understanding. Now, Kant at the same time categorically said that nothing can be known of the self. Now, what is the nature of the self? He said it is transcendental. And he said it is transcendental and cannot be an object of knowledge because it is the very condition, not an object of knowledge. Quite like in a when a movie has been played, you don't see the screen because it is the very foundation upon which the movie has been played, right? You don't see the screen. Quite like that. You don't see the self because the self is the very condition of the cogitations. And now Kant also said that we have nevertheless this tendency to peep into the mystery. We don't have the apparatus to see the self, but nevertheless we have this tendency to peep into what is called the noema. I mean, not noema, it is noumena, because we are confined to the phenomena, and we have nevertheless this tendency to peep into what is called the noumena, though we will never succeed in seeing it. But when we come to Edmund Husserl, the transcendental ego assumes the form of pure consciousness, for which everything else that exists is an object, quite like Sankara. And it is the ground or the foundation and constitution of all meaning. Husserl also thought that psychology, he says that, see, all those days, 1920s, psychology was born just then. And it was quite successful because employing the empirical method, psychologists were trying to say that what is happening in our mind, what is our mind being dispositional, so on and so forth. I don't want to get into that. But nevertheless, Husserl was adamant in saying that consciousness should not be a topic of the psychologists or anything empirical with regard to that. So the new science of subjectivity, he insisted, has to put aside all those natural scientific folk concepts of the psychic, and he thus in a way hijacked the very notion of self from the empirical and scientific realm to the realm of ontology, quite like Sankara, quite like Nagarjuna for that matter. Husserl takes off his theory of the self, recognizing now how did he starts. He starts by, his plane lifts by recognizing the individual consciousness in its full living richness. The consciousness is the single entity which is rich, which is dynamic, which thereby creates, as if by a miracle, a colorful world for it to enjoy. Inviting initially as a Heraclitean flux, as initially he thought it as a stream of consciousness, but quickly he has realized that stream concept has difficulties, because he realized that we will have to incorporate stages of sleep, dreaming, and so on and so forth. Now, if you ask me what is Husserlian phenomenology, quick answer would be that it is a way in which human consciousness grasps reality by striving to isolate the process of cognitive functions apart from any empirical data. See, now what psychologists would try to do is, they'll try to examine the empirical data that we have, and then they mistake it to be the self. Now, what Husserl has done is he tried to, bracket the contingent entities and then try to just see the form or the format by which these cogitations take place, and then try to catch that person who is beneath this whole lot of cogitations. So in his later period, Husserl's thought took an increasingly idealistic turn, and thereby he came closer to Sankara. Quite like Sankara, Husserl's transcendental phenomenological idealism is a demonstrative method. It speaks about the way back home, how the self can get back home. According to him, the world cannot be thought of except as being constituted by the transcendental ego's intentional act. The world, the so-called world, is nothing but the creation of the consciousness intentional activities. It follows that nothing can exist if it is not dependent for its existence on the transcendent self. So quite like Sankara, Husserl too distinguishes between the transcendental ego and the empirical ego. Quite like, the two birds that the Upanishads speak about, the one which eats the fruit and the one which is Sakshi, the one which talks about, watches about the whole thing. Here, Husserl too speaks about two types of egos. Egos of self, the transcendental ego and the empirical ego. Now, the latter is what gets constituted of the noetic content of our experience. You'll have to learn about this noetic and noematic. The noetic content is the mental act process which becomes directed towards the intentionally held object. That is, intentionally held object means the object which is being targeted by the consciousness. In other words, the I pole. So in every cognition, there are two poles, the I pole and the object pole. And they don't stand distinct. You can only conceptually distinguish them. So there is this I pole, which is the process that comes towards the object, and there is also the object which moves towards the self. So for Husserl, the phenomenological reduction, which is segregating the object from the I, the phenomenological reduction is the method of leading the human being whose life is involved in the world of things and persons back to the transcendental life of consciousness. Now, don't it sound a lot about what Sankara speaks about? You are masters of Sankara much more than me because you study the original text. So it should not be thought that this distinction between the pure self and the empirical self is made only by Advaitins and phenomenologists. Not at all. In fact, the clan of all first order philosophers across the world do speak about this. For instance, Wittgenstein, he says, I'm quoting Wittgenstein, he's an analytic thinker. He says the philosophical I is not the human being, not the human body, not the human soul of which psychology treats, but the metaphysical subject, the border, he says, the border, not a part of the world. Both things, he says, the metaphysical self is not in the world and the other thing we do not know. So he says it is in the border. So this Wittgensteinian distinction between the philosophical I and the psychological I is intended to convey that the latter, though empirically real, is not ultimately real. That is, the psychological I is not the ultimately real one. Now, getting back to Sankara. Now, let me speak about the problem of enworlded subjectivity. He says, in order to understand the enworlded subjectivity, we have to understand 5 things. What is the basic problem? Second, the method. And third, the presence of a transcendental principle whose evidence is apodictic, and a metaphysical thesis that emerges from it. Sorry, not 5-4. Now, let us begin by examining the problem. Part of it has already been discussed by me. Now, the problem basically is of discerning the pure subject from the embodied subject. In worldly life, they are so finely entangled and segregating, and therefore segregating one from the other is hard. Now, the pure consciousness is the real subjectivity having no relation with any object. It is transcendental, transrelational, and therefore disembodied. And this suggests that there got to be a dichotomy between Atma and Anatma. That is, pure consciousness as pure subjectivity and the world of objects, which is not the subject. But the problem is that, as I have indicated earlier, there is the involvement of consciousness in the objective world. That is, consciousness becomes worldly. This is what is called the enworlded subjectivity. In Husserlian terms, the naimatic intrigues the noetics and creates the life world. In Shankara's language, it is the loka vyavahara which creates the jiva. Now, the important question that we have to ask is, how is it possible that consciousness, now let us ask how the consciousness gets entangled. How is it possible that consciousness, which is essentially different from everything else, presented to it as its object, gets itself involved in the objects of the world surrounding it, losing it in a way its own identity, so much so that it is not even being reckoned as one of its own. Now, this is the problem of enworlded subjectivity. Now, here we will have to start the analysis. At the commencement of his commentary on Brahma Sutra, Sankara draws out the distinction draws our attention to this problem of enworlded subjectivity, and he draws the dichotomy between consciousness and what is presented to consciousness. So he draws the 2 poles, consciousness and what is being presented to consciousness. The latter, he says, is transcended to it. The anatma is transcended to it and therefore is an object of consciousness. Whereas consciousness, which reveals whatever is presented to it, is the object, is the subject par excellence. So pure consciousness stands as the supreme subject par excellence, objectifying everything other than it to the world or the world of object. To disclose this distinction, Shankara uses the word asmat and yushmat. Absorbed as we are in the transactional world, Nagarjuna also says about it. Absorbed as we are in the transactional world, there is this transaction that is happening between the jiva and the world. We fail to notice the radical distinction between the subject and the object and confuse and mix up one with the other. Now, the routine, natural mode of thinking and its resultant activity are due to the ignorance of the self, the pure consciousness, the transcendental subjectivity. Now, Shankara states that the asmat and the yushmat, the self and the not self, are opposed to each other and quite distinct, like light and darkness. Hence, it is wrong to superimpose one upon the other, which is of the nature. One, that is, if you superimpose the object onto the subject, it is like superimposing the darkness onto the light, because their characteristics are distinct. Having specified the problem, now let us move on to the method. Now, what is the method? Now, as I've said, that Advaita is all about the method. In Vedanta tradition, there is a rigorous inquiry into the given world. So, in order to get or segregate the pure self from the world, we should understand what the world is. So, what is the given world? The given world consists not only of the objects of the external world, but also the cogitations of various kinds. Don't think that they are, we are surrounded with objects, as though self is being placed in a storeroom where there are collections of objects. No, not at all. The world means not only the objects, but also our cogitations. My understanding of this code is also an object. Cogitations of various kinds of the mind that constitute the inner world. So quite like Shankara, that is, we have to take account of the inner world as well, apart from the external world. So quite like Shankara, Husserlian phenomenological epoch also calls for an inquiry into both the outer world. See, unless we understand how the world has been constructed, we will not be able to segregate the pure consciousness. So Husserl also speaks about about an understanding and analysis of the outer world and the inner world in order to find out their source, how the world has been raised. Husserl says, I'm quoting, it's a beautiful quotation, we must never lose sight of the fact that this transcendental phenomenology does nothing but interrogates just that world, which is the real world first. So we'll have to go on interrogating, questioning constantly the world, or understand the nature of the world by constant questioning about the world. And more you question the world, the more and more it gets detached from it. It has been pulled out from the self and made to stand in front of you, and constantly question the world. And this is a method that has been adopted both by Sankara as well as Husserl. So the primary task of phenomenology is to subject this world to intentional interrogation regarding its source of meaning and validity. Let's now see how Sankara highlights the method. While there can be only one self, see, by subject you should understand only one subject, owing to its limiting adjuncts, one self is practically treated as if it were two, just as we make a distinction between the Khatakasha and the Mahakasha. So the lower self, the jiva, forgetting that it's part of the world, poses though it is poses as though it is a subject. It puts upon itself the coat of its master, and then poses as though it is the real subject, and tries to engage the world in the act of knowing. Now, this is what is called episteme, where you have the exercise of knowledge. Now, this jiva puts upon the garb of the real subject, tries to engage the world through the process of knowing. Now, this exercise of knowing involves three factors: the knower, the known, and the process of knowledge. The three things. The Bhatta says Triputi. So the jiva employs the pratyakshadi pramanas and to get an objectival representation of the world. And mind you, it is not the case that always, and this is what is called the vritti jnana. And don't think that invariably the mind has been used as a medium. There are instances where pure consciousness directly also visualizes, as in the case of the ego, where mind does not become a mediator. So now, is this world thus known through vritti? Is this world thus raised by the jiva real one? Following the phenomenological method, Advaita maintains that whatever is cognized must be admitted to be existent. Because remember, they're phenomenologists. Because it is the experience that constitutes essence to the entity. Since I have seen a serpent in whatever the entity, be it rope or something else, there got to be some serpent there. So every cognition has a cognitor. So this is true of both the veridical cognition as well as erroneous cognition. In the example of rope snake, the snake presented at the first instance and which was sublated in the subsequent, when the light has been brought, you know that the snake gets sublated into the rope. But the sublated one, nevertheless, cannot be dismissed as something non-existent. At the same time, since it got sublated, it cannot be existent as well. So you know that Sankara has given a peculiar ontological status to this snake in the rope. So applying the same principle, I'm not repeating because this is all familiar to you. Since the objects of the world get sublated, when the awareness of the pure consciousness, they too are credited with an ontological status inferior to the absolute state. In brief, the phenomenological method employed by Sankara has effected in postulating what is called the levels of reality. That is the Vyavaharika, Pradibhasika, Vyavaharika, and the Paramarthika levels. So that is the phenomenally real, empirically real, and the absolutely real entities. And the transcendental consciousness, which is the absolutely real, has thus been pointed as the single goal of this regressive analysis. So it's necessary to bear in mind the distinction between the Vritti Jnana and the Swarupa Jnana. You know that Vritti Jnana is where there are cognitions one after the other, and mind you, it is all these cognitions are placed in the bottom, where the witness functions as the base of all this. What witnesses the series of cognitions which follow one another is the self, which is eternal consciousness, which does not form part of the series, and which has neither a beginning nor an end. And Sankara therefore speaks of two kinds of drishtis, the laukiki and the paramarthiki. While the former is the seeing of the mind through vrittis, laukiki drishti, the paramarthiki is the seeing of consciousness. And now this distinction highlights the role of consciousness as the witnessing or the knowing principle. Now the science of, I would try to call Advaita as a science, which speaks about the method to segregate the tendency of consciousness to transcend intentionality and return to its original hope. The whole all major business that Sankara takes up is to segregate this pure consciousness and segregate the tendency of consciousness to be intentional. Fine. See, that is when consciousness becomes intentional, it creates an object for its enjoyment. That is, it creates a Vishaya and then enjoys it. And it is this tendency that has to be stopped, and then it has to be brought back to its original home. Now, this study, ironically though, has to start from how this regressive method has to happen, should start from the world itself. Though it is the world that we want to disentangle, the study has to commence from the world itself. Vedanta tradition undertakes a regressive inquiry from the outer world to the inner world, and from the inner world to the source of both the inner world and the outer world, that is the pure consciousness. So this is the regressive method. From the outer world to the inner world, and to the inner world to the source of both these worlds, squashing all these worlds into the pure self. In fact, we draw a distinction between the outer world and the inner world only for the purpose of conceptual analysis. And that is why, when Samyamis, the so-called Samyamis, enjoy things in the mind, we say that it is more harmful because the inner world is as good as outer world. So whether you actually engage in wrongful actions or whether you mentally think about it, it has the same effect. So now these worlds cannot be kept in isolation from each other, the outer and the inner. The truth is that they interact with each other. They are in an effect. One is Sukshma, one is Sthula, that is all. So according to Advaita, the inquiry that is needed for unraveling the mystery of the enworlded subjectivity is facilitated by the principle of consciousness, by listening to the Shruti, Vakya, that it is being guided by this redressal, that is this retrieval of the self, has to be facilitated by the principle of consciousness itself. Now, can't it be just an assumption that no, why should you presume that there is something called pure consciousness? None of you have stumbled upon pure consciousness, I'm sure. You may stumble upon a ball that your child has placed on the way. You may stumble upon a table or a chair, but no one has so far stumbled upon pure consciousness. Now, how do you know that there is something called pure consciousness existing in this world? Now, Sankara says that the evidence of consciousness is apodetic, because everything else that exists point to the existence of it. Our knowledge claims presuppose the consciousness. How the principle of consciousness regulates our knowledge claim can be formulated in two ways. He says positively as well as negatively. What has been affirmed by consciousness cannot be negated, and what has been negated by consciousness cannot be affirmed. For Advaita, consciousness by its very nature is not intentional, it is pure. Phenomenologists would say that, not Husserl, but Heidegger would say that consciousness by nature is intentional, because it has invariably the tendency to get into the world or construct the world. But Shankara would say that no, consciousness is basically not intentional, because you can have consciousness which is happy with itself. It need not move towards the world. It nevertheless becomes intentional through the functioning of the mind. Here we may make a distinction between the foundational and the functional consciousness. The functional is the empirical, relational, while the foundational is the non-relational. So it is the association with the mind that makes it relational. Now, the empirical journey of the transcendental subjectivity to the world horizon passes through the landmarks of the mind senses. See, in order to understand how the regressive method can take place, you should know how the self moves out also. Only you understand the progress, you can speak about the regress. Now, how the progress takes place, it starts with the mind, the self gets in contact with the mind, then the senses, and then on to the objects. In the same route, you will have to take back the self. That is, withdraw the senses from the objects, That is why the analysis of the world has been done. So, once you understand the nature of the world, then you are slowly retrieving the self from the world. So, in the same route, as it progressed, it has to come back from the objects to the senses, from the senses to the mind, and from the mind to the laya of the pure consciousness. So as it moves from the non-dual, non-relation, there is a progressive entanglement that takes place with the pure consciousness, that unless it becomes a fully enworlded subjectivity, which is called jiva. That is what we are. So there is a need for a rigorous analysis of the objects presented to it, as I have explained to you, in order to catch hold of the phenomenological residue. What is this phenomenological residue? That is pure consciousness, the self, which is the substratum of all that has been created. And in this regressive analysis, the homecoming starts from the outer world to the inner world and to the self. The self is the destination of this inward journey. And in its inward journey, the Antakarana is the first, in the outward journey, it is the Antakarana. And in the inward journey, it is the Antakarana which is last being squashed out. Once the consciousness comes with the association of the Antakarana and the ego, and what happens is how the world has been constructed. Once the consciousness comes into contact with the Antakarana, the I becomes the subject, as I have said, and then it becomes the agent. It poses itself as the real agent, quite like the analogy used is, the servant poses as if he's the master, so on and so forth. In Sureshwara's language, it is as if the self has put on a mask. Husserl also speaks about this epoche performing ego. Now, therefore, Advaita speaks about a rigorous, regressive analysis of the self to catch back the self. To sum up, Advaita holds that consciousness is the transcendental a priori. What is a priori? Is something which is known without experience, prior to experience, a priori of all objects. Every cognation necessitating its existence, every cognation indicating its existence, which is behind all the cogitations, which is behind all the existence, which is the significant existence, which is Drashtavyo, Shrotavyo, Mantavyo, Nididhyasitavyo. So the point to be noted here is that Advaita does not deny the existence of the objective world. All that it denies is its independent existence as phenomenologies as they are. It is the jiva which creates the world for its own purpose. So the standpoint of the Husserlian phenomenology is surprisingly so close with that of Sankara that one cannot miss but see the identity between these two schools. And I suggest the young researchers to see, and while Husserl only goes halfway, Sankara takes us all the way back home. And probably it will be hard for you to communicate with the West because Shruti Pramanyatva will be hard for them to make them understand. But why? I don't suggest that you will have to dilute anything of what Shankara has been said. Shruti Pramanya. If you take away the Shruti Pramanya from Shankara, then he is lost. You can't even speak of him. So keep Shankara intact with all that is. Don't dilute the tradition. Recently I was speaking about the tradition. What is the text? And the Bhagavad Gita Bhashya, Asampradaya Sarvashastra Vidobi Asampradaya Murghavad Upekshaniyaha. So Sampradaya is very, very important for the young here. While you try to eagerly, enthusiastically juxtapose Advaita with the alien thoughts, don't lose the Sampradaya. Sampradaya is very important. Present Shankara as he is, and try to see the novelties. This is what is called the interpretation. It is not that you pull him down to our mundane level and then make him dirty. No, you should be very, very careful. And if you are not sure, please don't do it. So if you are confident of Shankara, only then you will have to lay your hands juxtaposing him with an alien thought. And so all I suggest is that taking Shankara ahead. And he also speaks about subsequently how the Shravana Manana, what is Shravana? Guided reading or guided study, Manana and Nididhyasana, how we can attain this. He just doesn't stop by the phenomenological exercise of the world and the enworlded subjectivity and the pure consciousness. No. He also tells us how to gain this, how to gain the self, how to take back this real agent which is concealing behind. So this is a wonderful science, as I have been taught by my masters, great by my masters, that I could see these sciences. And my appeal to the young is that study it within the tradition. You have all the amenities in and around, great teachers, Shivas here. I also, there are a couple of good scholars in the department. So I look forward for upcoming studies and researches juxtaposing Advaita Vedanta, so that the West also, let the globe also understand, not that we will have to get it ratified or attested by the West, not at all, not for that. Let them also get benefited by this philosophies. So thank you for this opportunity, Nishad, once again. Namaste to all.
Thank you, teacher. Very vibrating and informative, inspiring talk you have done. Thank you, teacher. നമുക്ക് ശങ്കര വേദാന്തത്തിന് അപകർഷതാബോധമല്ല വേണ്ടത്, മറിച്ച് മുഴുവൻ വഴിയും എത്തിക്കുന്നത് ശങ്കര വേദാന്തമാണെന്നും അതിനെ ഡൈല്യൂട്ട് ചെയ്യേണ്ട ആവശ്യമില്ലെന്നും അതെന്താണോ അതിനെ അതുപോലെ തന്നെ പ്രസന്റ് ചെയ്യുകയാണ് കാലഘട്ടത്തിന്റെ ആവശ്യമെന്നുമാണ് ടീച്ചർ കൺക്ലൂഷനിൽ ഊന്നി പറഞ്ഞത്. അതോടൊപ്പം നമുക്ക് ഡയലോഗുകൾ സാധ്യമാണ്. ഈസ്റ്റ് വെസ്റ്റ് എന്നുള്ള ബൈനറികൾക്കപ്പുറം ദാർശനികമായ സംവാദങ്ങളുടെ ഇടം ധാരാളമുണ്ട്, ഒത്തിരി വഴികളുണ്ട്, പാലങ്ങളുണ്ട് എന്ന ബോധ്യപ്പെടുത്തുകയാണ് ടീച്ചർ പേപ്പറിലൂടെ ചെയ്തത്. ധാരാളം ഇടങ്ങളിൽ, ഇപ്പൊ ഒന്നൊന്നായി എണ്ണി പറയേണ്ട ആവശ്യമില്ല. ഇപ്പോൾ മുണ്ടകോപനിഷത്തിലെ ദ്വാ സുപർണ സയുജ സഖായോ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞുകൊണ്ട് എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഈ പരമാത്മാവും അത് എങ്ങനെയാണ് വേൾഡ് ഫോമിൽ കാണപ്പെടുന്നത് എന്നും, അതുപോലെ തന്നെ സംബന്ധിച്ച് പരമാത്മ തത്വത്തെ എങ്ങനെയാണ് വെസ്റ്റിൽ ഹസറിലൂടെ ആവിഷ്കരിക്കപ്പെട്ടിട്ടുള്ളത് എന്ന്, ഇങ്ങനെ ധാരാളം സംവാദത്തിന്റെ ഇടങ്ങൾ, സൂചനകൾ തുറന്നു തരുന്ന ഒരു ടോക്കായിരുന്നു ടീച്ചറുടെ. നമുക്ക് അഭിപ്രായങ്ങൾക്കും സംശയങ്ങൾക്കും ഒക്കെയുള്ള അവസരമാണ്. അതോടൊപ്പം ഒരു ആഗ്രഹം കൂടിയുള്ളത്, ഈ ഒരു വിഷയത്തിൽ കൂടുതൽ അന്വേഷണങ്ങൾ, അതായത് വെസ്റ്റേൺ ഫിലോസഫിയുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട അന്വേഷണങ്ങൾ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ താരതമ്യ അന്വേഷണങ്ങൾ, ആ ഒരു ഡയലോഗ് തുടർന്ന് കൊണ്ടുപോകാൻ സാധിക്കണം. അതിന് ടീച്ചറെ പോലെയുള്ള ആളുകളെ നമുക്ക് എപ്പോഴും ആശ്രയിക്കാവുന്നതാണ്. നമ്മുടെ സർവകലാശാലയിൽ തന്നെയുള്ള ആളായതുകൊണ്ട് ഗൈഡൻസിന് വേണ്ടി ആശ്രയിക്കാവുന്നതാണ്. അതൊരു വലിയ ഒരു ഇന്റലക്ച്വൽ ഇവന്റ് ആയിരിക്കും എന്ന് തന്നെ തോന്നുന്നു. എന്തായാലും എല്ലാ വിദ്യാർത്ഥികളിൽ നിന്നും അധ്യാപകരിൽ നിന്നും അഭിപ്രായങ്ങളും സംശയങ്ങളും കൂട്ടിച്ചേർക്കലുകളും ഒക്കെ ക്ഷണിക്കുന്നു.
Those who are interested in juxtaposing not only Advaita, either Indian philosophical stream ayalum, you are free to march into International School for Sree Sankaracharya Studies. We are all eager to help the young. So please make use of the activities of the school. And it is very unfortunate that ഈ വിളക്കിന്റെ ചുവട്ടിലെ എപ്പോഴും ഇരുട്ടാവും എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞതുപോലെ ഈ സ്കൂളിന്റെ പ്രവർത്തനങ്ങള് ലോകമെമ്പാടും അറിയപ്പെടുമ്പോഴും ശങ്കരാചാര്യ സംസ്കൃത സർവകലാശാലയില് ഇത് വളരെയധികം പ്രയോജനപ്പെടുന്നില്ല എന്നുള്ളത് ദുഃഖകരമായൊരു കാര്യമാണ്. അതുകൊണ്ട് researchers, young researchers and young teachers, please fill your reservoirs. കാരണം റിസർവോയറിൽ വെള്ളം ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ടാപ്പിൽ കൂടെ വെള്ളം വരും. So we need to enrich ourselves, and it is useful empirically. ഞങ്ങൾ യങ്സ്റ്റേഴ്സിന് റിസർച്ചിന് ധാരാളം ഫിനാൻഷ്യൽ ഓപ്പർച്യൂണിറ്റീസ് തുറന്നു വെക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. So if you have any research interest, do communicate with us. Shiba is here. You can also converse with Dr. Sangameshan if you have any hesitancy to come to me. So do share your thoughts with them, and then we will help you out. Is there Ramya here? Ramya, are you there? I saw your comment somewhere. Where have you signed out?
Teacher, that is Ramya from Vedanta department. She's a research scholar from Vedanta.
Oh, probably my students do not know that. Now these days, talks are too often that I don't mail it to them. If there is no discussion, then we will probably, there are two possibilities. One thing is that they have understood everything. It is so very clear. And the other thing is that probably they did not understand anything. So I know not.
It is very clear and very, very interesting, and everybody can understand what you say.
See, that is why.
From the Department of Vedanta. Most of them are from the Department of Vedanta. From the UG classes. From the UG classes onwards, they study the Ajasabhashya, the famous Upanishad, Mandukya Upanishad, Egatma Pratyasara.
മഹാഭാഗ്യല്ലേ?
Thank you, teacher.
അതെ, ആ വിഷയം പഠിക്കാനും പഠിപ്പിക്കാനും ഒക്കെ പൂർവ്വജന്മ സുഹൃതം വേണം.
ടീച്ചർ പറഞ്ഞത് ശരിയാണ് ടീച്ചറെ. ദുർലഭം ത്രയമേവേത് ദൈവാനുഗ്രഹ ഹേതുകം മനുഷ്യത്വം മുമുക്ഷുത്വം മഹാപുരുഷ സംശ്രയ. ഇത് മൂന്നും വളരെ ദുർലഭമായിട്ട് കിട്ടുന്നതാണ്. ടീച്ചർ ഈ പറഞ്ഞതുപോലെ ടീച്ചർക്കും അതുണ്ടല്ലോ തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും. ടീച്ചറിനെ പോലെയുള്ള സംസ്കൃതവും അതുപോലെ തന്നെ വെസ്റ്റേൺ ഫിലോസഫിയും ഒക്കെ ഒരേപോലെ, ഇന്ത്യൻ ഫിലോസഫിയും സംസ്കൃതവും വെസ്റ്റേൺ ഫിലോസഫിയും ഒരേപോലെ കൈകാര്യം ചെയ്യുന്ന ഇന്റർനാഷണലി റെപ്യൂട്ടഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള അധ്യാപകര്.
എന്റെ ഭാഗ്യം എന്താ വെച്ചാല് സംസ്കൃത യൂണിവേഴ്സിറ്റിയിൽ വരാനും പണ്ട് നിർത്തിവെച്ച സംസ്കൃത പഠനം നിങ്ങളുടെയൊക്കെ സഹായത്തോടുകൂടി ഒന്നുകൂടെ ഒന്ന് പൊടിതട്ടിയെടുക്കാനും ഒക്കെ പറ്റുന്നത്. ഇല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഞങ്ങള് വെറും അനാലിസിസിൽ വീണു പോയേനെ. But anyway, that is my fortune. So thank you all. Nisha, shall we log out?
ടീച്ചറെ നമസ്കാരം. കൊയിലാണ്ടിയിൽ നിന്ന് വളരെ സന്തോഷം.
എനിക്കറിയാവുന്ന ആളാണല്ലോ. ഐ സീ ദ ഫോട്ടോ.
വേദാന്തത്തിലെ ഷീന.
അറിയാം. നിങ്ങളുടെ പേരും രൂപവും കൂടെ എനിക്ക് പരസ്പരം ബന്ധപ്പെടുത്താൻ ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടുണ്ടെന്നേ ഉള്ളൂ. കണ്ടാൽ ആൾക്കാരെ അറിയാം.
ഓ ടീച്ചറെ വളരെ സന്തോഷം.
വളരെ സന്തോഷം. പഠിപ്പിക്കുകയാണ് അവിടെ അല്ലേ?
അതെ.
അതാ നിങ്ങളെയൊക്കെ ഉദ്ദേശിച്ചാണ് ഞാൻ ഈ നേരത്തെ ISSന്റെ കാര്യം പറഞ്ഞത്.
മുഴുവൻ കേറാറുണ്ട് ടീച്ചറെ, എല്ലാം കേൾക്കാറുണ്ട് ടീച്ചറിന്റെ ടോക്ക് എല്ലാം തന്നെ.
കേൾക്കുന്നതല്ല കുഞ്ഞെ, നിങ്ങളായിട്ട് എന്തെങ്കിലും ചെറിയ ചെറിയ റിസർച്ച് ഇനിഷ്യേറ്റീവ് ഒക്കെ ചെയ്യും. അതിനൊരു ഇൻസ്റ്റിറ്റ്യൂട്ട് അതിനായിട്ട് വാതായനങ്ങൾ തുറന്നു വെക്കുമ്പോൾ നിങ്ങൾ അത് ഏറ്റവും നന്നായിട്ട് പ്രയോജനപ്പെടുത്തണമെന്നാണ് എനിക്ക് എല്ലാവരോടും പറയാനുള്ളത്. ആൻഡ് അപ്പോ ഷീബ കൂടെ ഉള്ളതുകൊണ്ട് ഞാൻ പറയുക, ഞങ്ങൾക്ക് കുറെ യൂത്തിനെ ഒന്ന് ട്രെയിൻ ചെയ്തെടുക്കണം എന്നുണ്ട്. ഇല്ലേ ഷീബ? ഷീബ ഉണ്ടോ ഇവിടെ?
ഉണ്ട് ടീച്ചറെ, തീർച്ചയായും. നമ്മള് അതിനാണല്ലോ യങ് സ്കോളേഴ്സ് ഒരു സെമിനാർ പ്രസന്റേഷൻ കോമ്പറ്റീഷൻ വെച്ചതും. അതുപോലെ ഇവരുടെ ഒരു എന്താ പറയുന്ന സ്റ്റേജ് ഫിയർന്നോ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ മുന്നോട്ടെത്താനുള്ള ഒരു മടി ഒഴിവാക്കിയിട്ട് ഇവരെ ഒന്ന് മുൻനിരയിലേക്ക് കൊണ്ടുവരാന് അത് ടീച്ചർ എന്നും പറയുന്നതാ. ഈ 7-8 മാസമായിട്ട് ടീച്ചറിന്റെ അടുത്തുനിന്ന് ഞാൻ എന്നും കേൾക്കുന്ന ഒരു ആവശ്യമാണ്.
പടിയിറങ്ങുന്നതിന് മുമ്പ് കുറച്ച് യൂത്തിന് നമുക്ക് ലോകം മുഴുവൻ നന്നാക്കാനൊന്നും പറ്റില്ല. പക്ഷെ കുറച്ച് യൂത്തിന് ഓറിയന്റേഷൻ കൊടുക്കാമെങ്കിൽ നമുക്ക് അതിന് ധനമുണ്ട്, കഴിവുണ്ട്, മനസ്സുണ്ട്. അതുകൊണ്ട് നിഷാദ്, ഡു യു ഹിയർ മീ? എല്ലാ സെന്റേഴ്സിലുമുള്ള അറ്റ്ലീസ്റ്റ് വേദാന്ത. നിഷാദ് കേൾക്കുന്നുണ്ടോ ഞാൻ പറയുന്നത്? നിങ്ങളുടെ അടുത്തുള്ള യങ് റിസർച്ചേഴ്സ്, പ്രോമിസിംഗ് മാസ്റ്റേഴ്സ് സ്റ്റുഡന്റ്, യങ് അസിസ്റ്റന്റ് പ്രൊഫസേഴ്സ്, കോൺട്രാക്ട് ലെക്ചറേഴ്സ്, അവരൊക്കെയാണ് നാളത്തെ വാഗ്ദാനങ്ങൾ. അവരെ നമ്മൾ ഇതിന്റെ താക്കോല് ഏൽപ്പിച്ച് അവരെ മിടുക്കരാക്കിയില്ലെങ്കിൽ പിന്നെ ഇതിന് ഭാവിയില്ല. അത് എൻ്റെ ഒരു വലിയ കൺസേൺ ആണ്. അത് ശിവ പറയുന്നത്. ഞാനതിങ്ങനെ ആവർത്തന വിരസമാണെന്ന് അറിയാമെങ്കിലും തുടർച്ചയായിട്ടത് പറഞ്ഞുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്നത് എൻ്റെ മനസ്സിന്റെ ഒരു ആവലാതി ഉണ്ടാകും. അപ്പോ നിങ്ങൾ എല്ലാവരും മുന്നോട്ട് വരൂ. ചെറുതായിട്ടെങ്കിലും നിങ്ങൾക്ക് ഓരോ റിസർച്ച് പ്രോജക്റ്റ് എടുത്തിട്ട് just let it be 1 lakh rupees ka project, but come forward, do the research and get engaged. ഒരു സമയം ഒരു പ്രോജക്റ്റ് ഇല്ലാണ്ട് ഇരിക്കരുത്, കയ്യിൽ ഒരു പ്രോജക്റ്റ് ഇല്ലാണ്ട് ഇരിക്കരുത് എന്നാണ് എൻ്റെ അഭിപ്രായം. ബിക്കോസ് പ്രോജക്ട്സ് വിൽ മേക്ക് യു റീഡ്. Even at this age I apply for projects. Though people will make fun of me, since people know me everywhere. Sreekala, you should be giving projects, not taking projects. ഞാനും കൊടുത്ത പിന്നെ എനിക്ക് എങ്ങനെ കിട്ടുക എന്ന് ഞാൻ അവരെ കളിയാക്കി ചോദിക്കാറുണ്ടോ. അതിന്റെ ബേസിക് ലോജിക് ഇതാണ്. കാരണം പ്രോജക്റ്റ് ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ നിങ്ങൾ വായിക്കുള്ളൂ, നിങ്ങൾ എഴുതുള്ളൂ. അല്ലെങ്കിൽ നമുക്ക് തന്നെ ഇരുന്ന് എഴുതാൻ ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടാണ്. ഓക്കെ, അപ്പോ നിഷാദ് ഞാൻ പറഞ്ഞതുപോലെയൊക്കെ ചെയ്യാം.
നമുക്ക് ശ്രമിക്കാം ടീച്ചർ. അങ്ങനെ ഒരു ടീം ഉണ്ടാകട്ടെ. എല്ലാ പരിശ്രമങ്ങളും ഉണ്ടാവും. ശരി
ടീച്ചർ, കൊയിലാണ്ടി സെന്ററിൽ നിന്നും മഹിമയാണ്. ശ്രീകല ടീച്ചർ, ഞാൻ പനി ആയതുകൊണ്ടാണ് വീഡിയോ ഓൺ ചെയ്യാത്തത്, കുറച്ച് ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടുള്ളതുകൊണ്ട് സംസാരിക്കാൻ. ടീച്ചർ അങ്ങനെ ഒരു ഓറിയന്റേഷന്റെ കാര്യം പറഞ്ഞല്ലോ, ഈ പ്രൊജക്ട് ഒക്കെ ഏറ്റെടുക്കാനുള്ള ഓറിയന്റേഷൻ തരാന്ന് പറഞ്ഞല്ലോ. അത് തന്നു കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ എന്തായാലും ഞങ്ങൾ
ഓറിയന്റേഷൻ അല്ല, ലെറ്റ് മീ സ്റ്റാൻഡ് കറക്റ്റഡ്, ഫിനാൻസ്.
ഓക്കെ
പൈസ കൊടുക്കും. ഞാൻ
ടീച്ചർ
വർത്തമാനം മാത്രമല്ല, ഞാൻ പറയുന്നതൊക്കെ ഞാൻ ചെയ്തിരിക്കും.
ഓക്കെ ടീച്ചർ,
But
ഞങ്ങൾ
there will be
കൂടെ ഉണ്ടാവും.
competition. You will have to submit your project. We will scrutinize it. നിങ്ങളെ പ്രോജക്റ്റ് എഴുതേണ്ടത് എങ്ങനെയാണെന്ന് പോലും ഞങ്ങൾ പറഞ്ഞു തരും.
ടീച്ചർ, ഞങ്ങളിപ്പോ പുതുതായിട്ട് ജോയിൻ ചെയ്തത് കൊണ്ട് അതിനെ പറ്റിയുള്ള ഒരു സംശയങ്ങൾ ഒരുപാടുണ്ട്. അതുകൊണ്ടാണ് ഒരു ഓറിയന്റേഷൻ ഉള്ള രീതി കിട്ടുകയാണെങ്കിൽ ഞങ്ങൾ തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും കൂടെ ഉണ്ടാവും.
ഷീബ, നമുക്ക് ഒരു ദിവസം ഒരു എങ്ങനെ ഹൗ ടു റൈറ്റ് എ പ്രോജക്റ്റ് എന്നൊരു ഓറിയന്റേഷൻ കൊടുത്താലോ ഷീബ?
കൊടുക്കാം ടീച്ചർ. അത് സംഗമേശൻ മാഷ് അന്ന് പറഞ്ഞതാണ്. നമുക്ക് ഇവർക്കൊരു 2 days ഒരു 1 day ട്രിപ്പും ഒക്കെ വെച്ചിട്ട് നമ്മൾക്ക് ഇവരെ ഒന്ന്
ചെയ്യും. ഈ ട്രിപ്പിന് ഐ എം നോട്ട് എ ഗുഡ് കമ്പനി പ്രോബബ്ലി, ബട്ട് ദ അതർ പാർട്ട് ഐ ക്യാൻ ഡു. ഹൗ ടു റൈറ്റ് എ പ്രോജക്റ്റ് എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞുതരാം. പിന്നെ എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഒരു പ്രോജക്റ്റ് എഴുതേണ്ടത്, എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഒരു പ്രോജക്റ്റ് റേസ് ചെയ്യേണ്ടത്, അതൊക്കെ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് പറഞ്ഞു തരാം. വി വിൽ ഷോർട്ട്ലി. അത് ഓർത്തോളൂ ഷീബ. നമുക്ക് അങ്ങനെ ഒരു 1 day പ്രോഗ്രാമോ എന്തെങ്കിലും നമുക്ക് രാവിലെ പ്രോജക്റ്റ് വെച്ചിട്ട് ആഫ്റ്റർനൂൺ വാട്ട് എവർ യു വോണ്ട് യു ക്യാൻ എന്റർടൈൻ ദം. രാവിലെ നമുക്ക് ഒരു എങ്ങനെയാണ് പ്രോജക്റ്റ് റേസ് ചെയ്യേണ്ടത് എന്നുള്ളതിനെ പറ്റിയിട്ട് വി വിൽ ടേക്ക് ക്ലാസ്.
എന്തായാലും ടീച്ചറുടെ ക്ലാസ് വീണ്ടും കേട്ടതിൽ വളരെ സന്തോഷം. കാലടി വെച്ച് ടീച്ചറുടെ എല്ലാ ടോക്കിലും ഞങ്ങൾ പങ്കെടുക്കാറുണ്ടായിരുന്നു അവിടെ റിസർച്ച് ചെയ്ത സമയത്ത്. എന്തായാലും വളരെ സന്തോഷം.
Lovely idea. So make use of these institutions. നിങ്ങളുടെ ചുറ്റുമുള്ള ഈ ഇൻസ്റ്റിറ്റ്യൂഷൻസ് ഒക്കെ നിങ്ങൾ നന്നായിട്ട് ഉപയോഗിച്ച് വേദാന്തത്തിന്റെ, ബിക്കോസ് യു ആർ സിറ്റിംഗ് ഓൺ എ ട്രഷർ. നിങ്ങളൊരു കല്ലിന്റെ പുറത്തല്ല ഇരിക്കുന്നത്, ഒരു ട്രഷറിന്റെ പുറത്താണ് നിങ്ങൾ ഇരിക്കുന്നത്. അത് നിങ്ങൾ അറിഞ്ഞില്ലെങ്കിൽ നിങ്ങൾ അത് കല്ലെന്ന് ധരിക്കും. അപ്പോ അതിനെ നന്നായിട്ട് ഉപയോഗിച്ചില്ലെങ്കിൽ പിന്നെ ഭാവിയിൽ നിങ്ങൾ വേദാന്തം പഠിക്കാൻ ഓക്സ്ഫോർഡിൽ പോകേണ്ടി വരും. ഇപ്പോഴും തന്നെ ഏകദേശം അതൊക്കെ ആയിട്ടുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ നമ്മളൊന്ന് ഉണർന്ന് പ്രവർത്തിക്കേണ്ട അത്യാവശ്യം ആയിരിക്കുന്നു. ഓക്കെ ഓക്കെ, താങ്ക് യു ഓൾ. Can we sign out?
ടീച്ചർ, വേദാന്തത്തിലെ രമ്യാണ്. വളരെ നല്ല ക്ലാസ് ആയിരുന്നു. താങ്ക് യു ടീച്ചർ. ഞങ്ങൾ ഉണ്ടായിരിക്കും എന്തായാലും.
നിങ്ങൾക്ക് ഞാൻ ഷീബയും കൂടെ പറഞ്ഞിട്ട് ഞങ്ങൾ ഒരു ദിവസത്തെ ഒരു ഓറിയന്റേഷൻ, നിങ്ങൾ എങ്ങനെയാണ് പ്രോജക്റ്റ് എഴുതേണ്ടത്, എന്തൊക്കെയാണ്, ഞാൻ കുറെ ടോപ്പിക്സും സജസ്റ്റ് ചെയ്യാം. അപ്പോ ഇല്ലേ ഷീബ? അപ്പൊ ഇവർക്ക് എങ്ങനെയാണ് പ്രോജക്റ്റ് എഴുതേണ്ടത്, കുറെ ടോപ്പിക്സ് ഐഡിയ
റെലവന്റ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഏരിയാസ് അവർക്കൊന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു കൊടുക്കാം ടീച്ചർ.
അത് നമുക്ക് ചെയ്യാം. ശരി
ടീച്ചർ, shall we conclude ടീച്ചർ?
പ്ലീസ്.
വോട്ട് ഓഫ് താങ്ക്സിന് വേണ്ടി ദൃശ്യയെ ക്ഷണിക്കുന്നു.
ശ്രീ ശങ്കരാചാര്യ സംസ്കൃത സർവകലാശാല പ്രാദേശിക കേന്ദ്രം കൊയിലാണ്ടി വേദാന്തത്തിന്റെ ആഭിമുഖ്യത്തിൽ നടത്തിവരുന്ന 3-day നാഷണൽ വെബിനാറിലെ 2ാമത്തെ സെക്ഷനിൽ ദ പ്രോബ്ലം ഓഫ് ദ എൻവേൾഡഡ് സബ്ജക്റ്റിവിറ്റി ഹസൽ ആൻഡ് ശങ്കര എന്ന വിഷയം വളരെ നല്ല രീതിയിൽ നമുക്ക് വേണ്ടി അവതരിപ്പിച്ച ഡോക്ടർ ശ്രീകല ടീച്ചർക്ക് എൻ്റെ പേരിലും വേദാന്ത വിഭാഗത്തിന്റെ പേരിലും കൊയിലാണ്ടി പ്രാദേശിക കേന്ദ്രത്തിന്റെ പേരിലും ആദ്യം തന്നെ നന്ദി അറിയിക്കുന്നു. കൂടാതെ ഈ നാഷണൽ വെബിനാറിന് നേതൃത്വം വഹിക്കുന്ന വേദാന്ത വിഭാഗം HOD ഡോക്ടർ നിഷാന്ത് സാറിനും ഈ സെക്ഷൻ സ്വാഗതം അർപ്പിച്ച ഡോക്ടർ സുരേഷ് സാറിനും ഇത്രയും നേരം ടീച്ചറെ ക്ലാസ് ശ്രദ്ധയോടെ കേട്ടുകൊണ്ടിരുന്ന മറ്റെല്ലാ അധ്യാപകർക്കും വിദ്യാർത്ഥികൾക്കും എൻ്റെ പേരിലും വേദാന്ത വിഭാഗത്തിന്റെ പേരിലും കൊയിലാണ്ടി പ്രാദേശിക കേന്ദ്രത്തിന്റെ പേരിലും നന്ദി അറിയിക്കുകയാണ്. നന്ദി.